one person that is actually out there digging up or trying to dig up mineral wealth from the mountains. Usually there's another 10 people out there trying to mine the miner. Be it the grocers, the farmers, the gamblers, the hookers, the dancers, whatever in terms of all of this. And from the beginning, Denver sees that vice is a very, very profitable enterprise in terms of that. And early on, Denver adopts strict moral legislation where all prostitution is ostensibly illegal. Gambling is ostensibly illegal, but it is tolerated if you are a patriotic citizen and make the appropriate contributions in terms of that. Moreover, people that work in the business were very, very patriotic. And come election day, they voted early and they voted often. And part and parcel of the way Denver politics used to work was something called the repeater wagon. And here it is, 7 a.m. on election day. You are expected to report to your local precinct. And no sooner has the precinct opened its doors than the judge starts calling the roll. Is Mr. Adams here? Is Mr. Adams here? Hi, I'm Adams on that. Is Mr. Bailey here? I'm Bailey. I'm Carlson. I'm Dixon. Whatever. Once you voted to show that we appreciated you turning out and doing your civic duty, you usually got a commission of $2 for casting your vote and often a free drink at an adjacent bar. You then got into a large horse-drawn carriage, and it would haul you a mile or two away to the next precinct out of that, where you could repeat the enterprise out of that, and on a very good day, you could go and cast 10, 12, 15 votes or so on that. But even in spite of this, sometimes the city would be in severe financial crisis. And when the city got in severe financial crisis, suddenly there would be a morals wave of reform of this, and the police would hit the bordellos, the casinos, and they would use the fines that were generated by the moral crackdowns to get the city out of hock along the way out of that. Well, by the 1890s, Denver is trying to project itself as a modern instant city. And population figures tend to illustrate this. In 1860, during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, Denver's population is 4,749 people. In 1870, the population is 4,759 people. They've gained 10 people in 10 years, in other words. By 1880, however, the population is 36,000. By 1890, the population is 106,000 of this. And moreover, not only is Denver now an instant city, but the sexual imbalance of early Denver is also evening out, where there is increasingly a very large number of politically active women. In fact, in 1893, a strong feminist movement pushes men to make Colorado the first state in the Union where men allow women complete, full, equal suffrage rights. And no sooner do the women have the vote than they want to do something with it. And they're complaining about these evil women of Market Street, which is the center of the red light district at that time. And they're demanding crackdowns or at least regulation on Market Street. And towards this end, Denver decides it's going to have what is called the segregated district. And the segregated district was basically about 18th Street to 23rd Street, from about Blake Street to the alley of Market, Larimer Streets, and that was where all the action was restricted. Moreover, all the women engaging in the trade had to wear the historic color of shame of medieval Europe, the historic color of prostitution, yellow. So on the day when the law goes on the book, the feminists of Denver are saying, hey, wait a minute, we have the right to wear yellow whenever we want to wear yellow out of was, and the law lands up being laughed off of the books and so on then. But still, Denver is undergoing various phases of goo-gooism. And a goo-goo is a goody-goody. Back in the 19th century, cities were considered par for the course of that. And if you wanted to get something from City Hall, you needed to pay for it. And every now and then there would be these waves of moral reforms when good government forces would demand clean, honest, efficient government. And in the wake of this national phenomenon, they once asked the boss of Boston what he thought about the Good Government League. And he says, they're a bunch of hopeless goody-goodies. Why, they aren't even that. They have all the mentality of my infant granddaughter. And like her, all they can go is prattle goo-goo, goo-goo, out of that there. But the goo-goos are sweeping the country. And typical of this is in 1908, prostitution is tolerated virtually every place. By 1918, it's illegal virtually every place. And Denver's crackdown tends to go between about 1912, 1914, when ostensibly prostitution becomes illegal. Well, amidst all of this, no sooner have they officially padlocked all the bordellos in town, then suddenly rooming houses start taking the place. And there happen to be some hotels downtown where here a tired, weary man can go in and check into a room for only a half hour or so on this. And no sooner is he in the room resting up than the maid will call on him and insisting she has to clean the room right then and there on that. And this leads to what is called the two-maid system. There is the legitimate maid, then there is the other maid of this, and before long the two-maid system is notorious out of that, and this goes on till 1923. And that year there's a group surging to power in town that is insisting Denver has to be a 100% pure, all-American Christian city out of that, and this group is the Ku Klux Klan. Before long, the Klan has upwards of 55,000 members. In a Denver of 250,000 population, in addition to a large woman's clan, in addition to a group called the Royal Riders of the Red Robe, which were naturalized immigrants that supported the Klan. And on this basis, in 1923, a Klansman, Ben Stapleton, is elected mayor of Denver. In 1924, a Klansman, Clarence Morley, is elected governor of Colorado. At the same year, 1924, a Klansman, Rice Means, is sent to the United States Senate from Colorado, and soon the Klan controls the Denver city government, a lot of the state government of this. There, however, once the Klan is in power, far from cracking down on vice, it is soon regulating it there, and soon now you have to make your appropriate contributions to the Klan. And amidst all of this, Mayor Stapleton, who is indeed a Puritan, is soon fighting with the leadership of the Klan for who's really running the city. So on Good Friday, 1925, Mayor Stapleton mobilizes Catholic members of the police department, joined with anti-Klan members of the American Legion, who are deputized to raid the bordellos, the casinos, the speakeasies, and there they find all the Klan police officers running vice in town. And suddenly the Klan, I never heard of the Klan. This is Grandpa's old nightshirt along the way out of that there, out of this there. And meanwhile, the police rule that the rooming houses will be tolerated as long as they obey certain regulations, that all maids must be fingerprinted and photographed, and the action must be within the diameter of basically 20th Street to Broadway, to 18th Street, to Market Street. And this goes on till about 1941. And it's all because of Laurie. We have to change something about all of this. Because at this time, Denver is presenting itself as Little Washington, as the alternative to Washington, where civil defense plans state that if for some reason Washington is threatened by an emergency, they will relocate government functions to Denver for the duration of the emergency. And meanwhile, they're building up Fitzsimmons Hospital, and Laurie Air Force Base is emerging as a major training facility of that. And in 1941, the War Department announces, we do not want our poor, innocent, pure, patriotic soldier boys corrupted by the evil maids in the rooming house on this. And on this basis, the War Department, working with the United States Public Health Service, tells Denver that if you want any more military assistance, any more federal health assistance, you are going to close down all of the rooming houses around town. And so they shuttered the rooming houses in July 1941, and we've had no more problems with prostitution in the area. Well, meanwhile, amidst all of these activities, what is going on in terms of it is Denver is starting to change its sexual predilections around the time of World War II. And it's not really until the late 1930s that burlesque or burlesque, burlesque is what the term always was in the industry of early striptease, is starting to emerge in terms of that around of this. And before long, especially near the convention trade hotels, you start getting places like the 400 Club and the 5 o'clock Club and the Chez Pandy of this, where I can remember as a boy going and waiting for the bus near 17th and Broadway, and it was always fun to look into the A-clothes of the various bars nearby because of the very suggestive photos that were always in place in terms of that. Well, anyway, what ends up happening with a lot of these places right by the Brown Palace, the old Cosmopolitan Hotel, Albany Hotel, is that they were essentially clip joints. And a clip joint is a special form of striptease of that. And what ends up happening on this is in a regular stripper bar, something like PT's just down the block from us, as part of the thriving reputation of East Colfax out of that, the guy basically goes to see naked women prance around of that. And apparently a lot of these stripper bars are extremely boring places. And nobody more advertises that they are extremely boring places than the stripper bars. There is, for example, a place called the Diamond Cabaret down near about Colfax and Fox, right across the street from the Justice Center. And what the Diamond Cabaret advertises is come in and see our big screen sports television and see our luxurious buffet spread out of it, with the implication the women there are just boring parts of the routine out of that. Well, meanwhile, usually what happens is a dancer is on an hourly cycle. She's on stage for about 15-20 minutes. She has a 15-20 minute break period where she freshens up, adjusts her costume to be ready for her next act, and 15-20 minutes where she socializes with members of the audience, tries to cage drinks from them, arranges table dances, details like that. Well, what happens in a clip joint is when a man comes in, a dancer that's in the socializing period will come up to him, she'll put her arm around him, she'll start cooing in his ear as she leads him into a booth on that, and as they sit down, she's leaning over with her very scanty bra, looking at him out of that, and meanwhile the man is usually fascinated of this. He's usually a middle-class businessman, middle-aged, that hasn't had a young woman like this come up, would the gentleman like to buy the lady a drink? And he knows that if he wants to retain her companionship, he needs to buy her a drink. And she, of course, orders the most expensive drink in the house, and the bottle of champagne that arrives for $50, $75, $100 a bottle out of this is a super cheap brand that usually goes in a liquor store for $3, $5 a bottle out of that. And no sooner has the waitress went and poured the glass of champagne than the dancer gulps it down, and gulps down another glass, and gulps down another glass, because obviously the more that he is paying for, the more she makes on this. But we can't have the dancer retaining her efficiency by heavily drinking all the evening, so right next to the champagne glass will be a frosted water glass, an empty frosted water glass. And what is going on is no sooner has she taken a huge gulp of champagne than she is seemingly taking a chaser of water. What she is really doing is spitting the champagne into the empty glass. Before long, the waitress comes over, takes and replaces the filled water glass with a fresh, empty one. She takes the used glass back to the bartender. The bartender takes out an empty bottle of champagne with a fancy label on it, with a funnel, and recycles the champagne for the next round of drinks on that. Well, anyway, amidst all these activities, after a while, if the guy is quite a gullible customer, they might go and slip him knockout drops. And when he wakes up an hour or two later, there are not just countless fancy liquor bottles around his table, there are empty cigar cases, whatever, and the manager comes over and gives him the bill for $3,000, $5,000, some absolutely ridiculous sum in terms of this. And if the guy gets excited, sir, there's no reason to get excited. Don't you remember before you passed out, you bought drinks on the house for everybody 3 times, and you bought everybody a $25 cigar? And, sir, if you would just calm down, sit down, I will serve you any drink in the house on me out of that. Just let's calm down. I'm sure we can reach an accommodation. And the drink that then arrives might well be poisoned or drugged. And the favorite drug to use is Yippee-Cat. And Yippee-Cat will induce instant vomiting. And suddenly the guy suddenly has to go but good. And as he rushes for the men's room, he suddenly finds it locked. On that, where he ends up fouling himself in the bar, the dancers start mocking him, while the bouncers are threatening him there. And amidst all of this, if he knows what's good for him, he's going to sign a check or a credit card slip or something to pay the bill in terms of all of that. And there's sporadic crackdowns on the industry itself, and right about the time that there is supposedly the end of what is called the Texas Mafia, this group that ran a series of clip joints, including a place called Tricky Dickie's up at Colfax and Clarkson Street. That itself, then the pubic wars break out in town, which is something of a legacy of Saturdays. Now what happens is about 1978, the courts rule that in the name of sexual expression and artistic control, dancers can take off their G-strings. And on this basis, you start getting new dancing. But bottomless dancing is far more than simply having the dancer take off her G-string. The question is what she does next on that. And in various bars, dancers come up with various routines on that. In some cases, for example, a dancer will ask if she can borrow the gentleman's long-necked beer bottle and land up inserting parts of it in a certain part of her anatomy. heavy in terms of that there. In other cases, what she'll do is she will take a book of matches and set the book of matches afire, and using exhalations from part of her body, blow out the matchbook in terms of this. Another routine is for a gentleman to go and to buy a roll of quarters. He is then to take the quarters out of the wrapper, but leave the roll in there on the side of the stage, where the dancer will go over and pick up the quarters using parts of her body, and then dance over to her chamber pot at the other side of the stage and deposit the quarters in them. And amidst all of that, there was perhaps the most notorious stripper bar of Denver at this time, was a joint called Sid King's Crazy Horse Bar up at Colfax and Marion Street. Now what Sid lands up coming up with, he was a great entrepreneur in the field out of this, was something called the Chicken Girl. And the Chicken Girl would be dressed up like a chicken out of that, and even as other parts of her clothing came off, she'd still have her wings on it, and she'd go around the stage, clock, 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 whatever on that there, and right amidst the routine where seemingly she is showing everything on that, she would get a hard-boiled egg on this. And she would stick the hard-boiled egg up a certain orifice and start dancing around, clock, 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 whatever, and suddenly squat down in terms of this, and using various muscular contortions, she would land up going and cracking and legging the egg out of that. She would then go and peel the egg on this and come up to a member of the audience, giving him the egg out of it, where he was expected to eat it as the consummation of the act. Well, for many years, the Crazy Horse Bar was right across the street from a fine German restaurant, the Heidelberg, off at the northwest corner of Colfax and Marion Street, and eventually a guy named Michael Schmidt is the chef over at the Heidelberg. His mother owns the Heidelberg, and meanwhile, Michael, who's in his early mid-20s, had grown up around Sid King's, was fascinated by the dancers at Sid King's out of that, and really liked the egg act. And this is the situation one night when the egg act is going over so well that Sid runs out of hard-boiled eggs. So he runs over to the Heidelberg where Michael's in the kitchen. Michael, quick, I need some hard-boiled eggs. And Michael knows exactly why Sid wants the hard-boiled eggs. So he puts the eggs in the boiling water for only about 30 seconds or so out of that, leading to a whole new routine in terms of all of that there. Well, after a couple, 3 years of these pubic wars where different bars keep going and competing for what is happening on this, they revise the statutes that basically state that if alcohol is being consumed on the premises, they cannot have bottomless dancers if they have what are called pop shops, where they only serve soda pop rather than alcohol. The dancers can show anything in terms of the routine out of that there, and that sort of then becomes the legacy of a place called Saturdays up at about Colfax and Verbena or so, that is emerging in the late 70s, early 80s as a pop shop in terms of the routine out of that. And meanwhile, as the state is trying more regulations, the people in the industry are coming up with counter initiatives, counter regulations. Out of that, among those that is real popular for a few years in the mid-80s is what is called nude mud wrestling, in terms of it, where the dancers get to settle their scores appropriately in terms of these routines itself. And meanwhile, what goes on in the pop shop is you can buy about 3 ounces of Coca-Cola, which are mostly ice anyway, out of that, for about $5 a drink out of that. And again, typical places that are changing like this was an old drive-in called Chat and Chew up at about Colfax and Jasmine at the southeast corner of that, and it ends up becoming a joint called the Tipsy Tiger that has severe problems or maybe severe attractions in terms of it for a few years. It later becomes a Honda dealership out of that. It's actually still in place as a different incarnation of that, but meanwhile, Colfax has replaced the clip joints down near 17th and Broadway. More than that, you also get something called the Skyline Urban Renewal Project, sweeping the city in the early 1970s. And as the Skyline Project is destroying the historic sleazy bars, saloons, porno district along Larimer Street, other than that, meanwhile, the businesses need to relocate, and they land up looking around, and they discover where the largest red light in Denver is located. And you go down to the Capitol after dark, and you look up at the peak of the dome of the Capitol. There's a big red light shining atop there, part of the state of Colorado's honesty in advertising policy on this. And what lands up happening on this is back in the 19th century, railroad brakemen come up with a red lantern meaning stop of that. In fact, that's where a red light comes from, is railroad signaling of this. Well, for various reasons, it was not safe for brakemen to take the red lanterns into bordellos, so they would hang their lanterns outside the bordellos on the porch, and where all the red lanterns were shining on the porches, others knew it was a good place to stop, hence the red light district along the way out of that there. And before long, you combine this with changing mores of the late 60s, early 70s, and the hippie movement, and Colfax near the Capitol becomes a totally different location than the middle-class, prestigious address it once was on that. And often what would happen of that is, especially runaway young women that thought they were running away to utopia and the hippie paradise, find that the only thing they have to sell is their bodies in one form or another out of this, and you soon start getting places with signs saying, photograph a totally nude woman, 10 pictures, $10. We provide the camera and film along the way out of that itself on there, and before long you have these various peep shows, peep arcades along Colfax, including what were called booth babies. And a booth baby was a private striptease dancer, and she usually would rent space from the proprietor of a porno joint of that, and she would sit around in a scanty suggested costume waiting for a gentleman to eye her. And once he had eyed her, she would lock herself into a bulletproof glass booth about the size of an old-fashioned telephone booth out of this, and pull the curtains, and if the guy wanted to see anything, and these are 1980s prices, he'd have to go and immediately deposit $50, plus basically $1 for every minute that she is performing. So basically, she'd pull over the curtains, he's in a comparable bulletproof glass booth out of that, and she'd show herself. If he wanted to see more, he had to keep putting money in there. Well, in the course of her slow, suggestive striptease, sometimes the booth baby would discover she was not the only person taking off her clothes. And sometimes the guy would be going and exposing himself, trying to proposition her, but it was very, very rare for him to succeed. And there is basically a strong sexual division of labor between hookers and dancers. And in the case of that, often hookers are very shy about exposing their bodies, while dancers look down on the hookers, and often the dancers have boyfriends or girlfriends. Some of them are men haters. And in particular, they get their jollies out of going and getting the men sexually excited out of that, but then leaving the place frustrated in terms of that. But by sheerest coincidence, often right outside some of the stripper bars, other places like this, there'd be a poor, unfortunate young woman, even on a frigid evening, standing nearby the stripper place, only having on short shorts and wearing a halter or something like that, hoping that a gentleman would stop and help warm her up in one form or another. And by sheerest coincidence again, often there would be nearby motels that were part of what was called the hot pillow trade. Out of this, where usually you'd rent the room for the hour and the maid would often make up the room again a dozen plus times a day as part of the routine. Out of that, incidentally, I never have come across any place in town where a woman can go and see a male booth baby perform. So if there's any entrepreneurs here, here's a free suggestion for you to deal with in terms of that. Well, a lot of this actually deals with this section of Colfax itself. And early on, with Lowry Air Force Base being nearby, you had a number of questionable or wild or erotic or outrageous bars along Colfax catering to the servicemen. And one's just down the block from here, an amazingly long-lived place called the Hangar. And often what would happen of that is that various airmen out at Lowry would go up and they would ask the sergeant, I ask permission to report to the hangar. So that's the hangar that they would land up reporting to service for in terms of that itself. And then there used to be a place called the Green Onion over at about Xenia and Colfax or so, which was actually an old house that was painted up in green that had a rather questionable reputation. Then it changed ownership, and the new owners got a deal on blue paint, so the Green Onion became the Blue Onion. In terms of that, there is another kind of gathering spot on that. And meanwhile, you also started going and getting a shift in terms of the prostitution industry. And basically, with the elimination of the rooming houses, you don't have the ostensible bordellos any longer on that. You do have the call girl industry quite prominent of this. In fact, the Brown Palace used to go and censor its phone books, because at one time, especially in the 1980s, 1990s, there would be not only sections of the daily newspapers that would have companionship columns on that, where a man could call a lonely woman for various enterprises. They would have escort services in the yellow pages out of that, and the Brown Palace usually cut out those sections of there, because we all know the Brown Palace would never engage in immoral activities down about there of that. Meanwhile, you would then have what were sometimes called hooker bars. And what would go on in a hooker bar is a guy would come in, the woman would approach him, see if he wanted to have some company. Out of that, once they landed up agreeing to terms on this, they would appropriately tip the waitress and then go upstairs, often to a hotel or a cheap room nearby, and consummate the trade. And no place was more notorious in terms of this action than a place called Denver's Oldest Bar. And Denver's Oldest Bar was the name of the joint, was over at the east corner of 17th Street and Marketplaces. And before long, it was a favorite destination of airmen out at Lowry. And this is the situation in the late 1940s, when suddenly a vicious wave of VD starts spreading among servicemen. And getting VD can be a court-martialable offense. And military health authorities trying to figure out where did all these guys with VD go where they got this vicious strain of it, and the answer ended up being Denver's oldest bar out of it. So soon the MPs are raiding it, declaring it off limits. Soon the Denver police are raiding it, and it just isn't working as a hooker bar as such. So the owner, Jules Schleffel, decides he's going to turn it into a topless dinner bar. And a topless dinner bar is where the waitresses serve the meals topless. That never worked ideally, and before long, Denver's oldest bar is another stripper bar, but it's trying to live up to its name with the oldest dancers in the field. Where you soon have women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, often going and strutting their charms on stage. In terms of that, mostly to a college boy audience, where the older women are showing the boys their battle scars, facts of life, other such things on that there. And downtown just hasn't been the same since Denver's oldest bar closed about 1974 or so. Sometimes women that would work in a place like Denver's oldest bar have been called go-go grannies. And what happens of this is a young woman at the peak of her career, in her early 20s, dancing at seemingly a premium gentleman's club like Shotgun Willie's or the Diamond Cabaret, can easily make well over $100,000 a year, mostly non-tax reportable, and for the most part, the women don't have the slightest idea how to save their money out of this. Before long, they're blowing it on fancy cars, fancy clothes, white powder, other such things, and within a few years, they're no longer the most nuptial dream girls imaginable out of it, but a lot of them don't have any other skills to perform, so they go over to your second-rate clubs or third-rate clubs, which used to long be the reputation of Saturdays on that, before the greatest show on earth took it over. And what happens is it's called PT's 2 on that. And PT's opens in the 1970s. Some claimed it stood for prick teasers, but the owner denied all of that. It was rather going to be after P.T. Barnum's The Greatest Show on Earth, and it occupied a place called the Family Dog out on West Evans Avenue at about Pecos. And back about 1967 or so, the Family Dog was on the cutting edge of hip capitalism. The claim is that rock and roll psychedelic music is not a form of revolt of a new society. It is rather a form of going and making a good profit for entrepreneurs out of that there. And before long, there are massive wars between the police and the owners of the Family Dog. Eventually it's the dog, it fails, whatever on that. So instead you get the greatest show on earth taking up part of that there, and slowly the empire that landed up owning PTs becomes a national operation. It eventually buys out Shotgun Willie's and keeps expanding. So obviously it needs to come up to East Colfax along the way out of that, and meanwhile you have the motel trade is still firmly in place on this part of Colfax. And originally what happened was Denver sort of ended at about Quebec Street, and the mile between Quebec and Zurich and Yosemite was sort of the entryway into the city back when US 40 was the main highway serving the section. Often travelers would be coming in, they're weary, their destination is coming into Denver, so once they're in Denver, so really defined actually as Aurora, at least to Peoria, maybe ideally Havana or so, out of that there, you would go and check into the motel. Often servicemen or families visiting servicemen would be in the motels itself on that. And meanwhile, in the course of the 1980s, 1990s, Korean entrepreneurs come on the scene out of that, and they see that there's some people in need of cheap lodging and get a hold of the motels, and their ethic is that of good business people. You got the money, you have a room here. Out of it, we don't worry about moral concerns or whatever in terms of it. And again, with Saturdays, other places nearby, by coincidence, you can do business out of these things, plus the streetwalkers, others on that. And for a few years, Denver and Aurora used to play ping pong with the streetwalkers. Denver would have a crackdown and chase them over to the Yosemite side of Aurora. After a while, Aurora would crack down and chase them back into Denver in terms of that. And fortunately, back in the 1990s, Denver had a mayor of moral integrity, Wellington West. And he was announcing that prostitution was horrid, these streetwalkers were a disgrace out of it, but he was claiming the people that were responsible were not so much the streetwalkers, it was rather the men that were going and approaching them. So soon there's a number of agent provocateurs, solicitors of police women grabbing men, and here you are, a student of the city, just wanting to find out who these women are, how they operate, what they want, and you could get your picture in the newspaper or on the city television station as part of that. And this is the situation when Mayor Webb launches a major crackdown about November 1998 or so out of it. And for a couple of months, he's promoting the crackdown. And then the stock show comes to Denver in January. And about a week before the stock show comes into town, the mayor announces, "We've accomplished all we can, and the campaign has been a great success out of that there." So again, it keeps going on and on in terms of all of that. Well, anyway, a lot of these stories are in my book, The Seamy Side of Denver. And what happens with this book is 30 years ago, July 1986, I started giving walking tours of town. Used to teach a class called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Denver through Denver Free University. And one night in July 1986, nobody showed up. And on a beautiful evening, I got bored and I decided to go for a stroll. And here I was, simply walking down Colfax backwards, wildly waving my arms about, talking to myself, and people started following me around. And on that basis, I started giving walking tours. Well, no sooner was I giving the walking tours than I had the challenge: do I tell the upright positive version of events or the outrageous scandalous version of events? And of course, I'm telling the outrageous scandalous version of events. Until one night, I'm giving a tour near the Capitol, and we stumble on a bottle party in an alley, and are asked if we'd like to shoot up with the crowd. And then I'm talking about the differences between topless and bottomless bars on Colfax. The next thing I know is a streetwalker approaches us as a guest speaker, and someone is absolutely disgusted with this, and he calls up my sponsoring organization, Colorado Free University, to complain about the foul-mouthed, evil-minded instructor who, for all intent and purposes, ought to be giving a tour of the seamy side of Denver. So in the fall of 1989, I started giving a tour focusing basically on 19th century sex, prostitution, gambling, bloody murder, after all sorts of things like that. And eventually, about 1993, I ended up putting them together in this book over here, which besides some of the stories on sex, has chapters on gambling, bloody murder, screwball preachers, corrupt cops, the porno industry, things like that out of that. And I still do give the seamy side tour. In fact, tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock, I'm meeting at another bookstore called City Stacks over at about 18th and Wazee. So let me know if you're interested on that there. My most recent book, incidentally, is something called How the West Side Won, the history of Greater West Denver, Auraria Campus, Lincoln Park, the Buckhorn Exchange, and the old Denver General Hospital, whatever, in terms of that there. Actually, my favorite book tends to be, has a little on this area, it's called the DIA and Other Scams, which is part of a comprehensive look at the city since World War II, and besides airport scams, has waterworks scams, library scams, school busing scams, savings and loan scams, whatever, on that, plus numerous other titles here. The current book I personally use, probably the most of any of my books, is something called the Denver History Index. And the Denver History Index, which came out 3 years ago, is basically the index to all of my other books. Because sometimes people ask me about something, they say, I read it in one of your books, and I have no memory at all of what that is in terms of it there. So this is what I consult, plus it has an autobiographical statement, on and on. But as you can see, Tim has plenty of my titles here and next door on that. But with all that said, are there questions, comments, ideas, rebuttals, personal memories on all of that yet?
Yeah, and I thought we could maybe just turn the Q&A session into, if you had something to contribute, or a way to offer alternate histories maybe, or complementary histories, stories, particularly of this specific area, East Colfax, East Montclair. But thank you so much, Phil. And questions, please ask. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So you're talking about the history of Saturdays.
Yeah.
So it started out as a restaurant called Famous Chef, right?
Yes.
And then it became a dance club, right?
Yes.
What was the dance club called? Saturdays, or was it Fridays and Saturdays?
I think it's Fridays first, changing ownership, Fridays and Saturdays, 2 Saturdays when it becomes the stripper joint.
Okay, gotcha. Do you know what year that happened?
No, I don't.
No.
I actually have a photo in the CD book of the old Saturday sign of that, which I can remember my photographer, technician complaining how difficult it was to reduce a color photo to black and white, because it was a very colorful sign that they actually had there. Other comments? Yes?
When I moved in to the north side of Colfax in this neighborhood in '94, I was told by an older neighbor that Stapleton's old house was somewhere in close vicinity.
Okay, there's all sorts of myths about where Ben Stapleton lives. He's a very shady character who was born in Kentucky about 1867 or 1871. He's about 8.5 inches, or he's 5'11" inches. He has hazel eyes or he has gray eyes. And these are different descriptions he gives of himself in official legal documents like applications for passports, military discharge records. Of that, he grows up in Kentucky, or maybe he grows up in Ohio, or maybe it's Minnesota, or whatever on that. And under rather shady circumstances where he never goes to law school, he shows up in North Denver about 1896 as a struggling attorney. He slowly rises, living in 4 or 5 different locations over on North Denver, near about 32nd and Alcott to 30th and Lowell Boulevard, of that, as he rises in something called the Big Mitt. And the Big Mitt was the name of the political machine running Denver in the early 20th century, overseen by Mayor Robert Speer. And under Mayor Speer, Stapleton becomes the police magistrate. And the role of the police magistrate basically is he's the guy that hears the cases when the policeman brings somebody in for disorderly conduct here or some minor offense, and basically the officer says, "This is what happened, Your Honor," and Stapleton goes guilty out of that. Things like hearing the defense or whatever is beyond him. So he rises in the machine. He lands up becoming Postmaster General of Denver about 1913. From there, he enters the oil business. He has no background in the oil business other than having done a lot of political favors for others. He makes a fairly immense fortune out of that. And at one time, he's living in an apartment near 13th and Pennsylvania. And then in the early 20s, he moves into something like 430 William Street Parkway, and that's where he lives till his death about 1949. I never had him living at all east of William Street.
Thank you.
Yes.
One of the,
Wasn't he,
oh, go ahead.
wasn't he also a member of the KKK?
Yes.
Yeah, we talked about
He is a member of the KKK, and what happens on this, at a very early date, he makes connections with John Galen Locke, who is the kingpin of the Klan in town. In fact, in 1919, Stapleton gives birth, or his wife gives birth to the only son he has, Ben Stapleton Jr., and the godfather of Ben Stapleton Jr. is John Galen Locke, the kingpin of the Klan. He's a secret member of the Klan, and as such, actually even denouncing secret organizations and people wearing masks in public. Stapleton is elected mayor in 1923 of that, and it soon exposed what his membership is. And then after he breaks with John Galen Locke in 1925, he never says anything about his Klan membership, sort of just lets it wither away. In the other room, there's a copy of my book called In the Shadow of the Klan, about what happens when the Ku Klux Klan runs Denver from about 1920 to 1926.
One of the, I'm not interrupting, I think you're going to wind up. One of the great things about this evening is that we have Tom Fessing here, the president of the East Montclair Neighborhood Association, and I wanted to make sure that you maybe have some alternate histories or definitely some comments to make about the seamy side of.
Phil's a hard act to follow.
I know, that's why I gave this to you. I wanted to get you.
As far as Ben Stapleton living in the area,
Yeah,
I've never heard that. The old Stapleton, or the municipal airport was built in 1929. And it was named Stapleton. Phil, when was it named after?
1944.
Yeah, 44. But yeah, I've never heard of him living in the neighborhood. Doesn't mean, though, that he didn't have a hooker in the neighborhood. That could have been
Considering his different identities, he could have had his secret houses over here,
yeah,
too.
that could have been a connection.
See, I can give a whole different version now of the neighborhood of the history of Montclair and how East Montclair and Waterworks and all of that go, but that's a whole different one, because a book I am tentatively planning of this is sort of Denver east of Colorado Boulevard, off to the south of Colfax Avenue. The reason I make Colfax the border point is a book I had come out about 3-4 years ago is called Park Hill Promise, about the area the other side of Colfax, off to the east of Colorado Boulevard there. And right now, this is just an idea I'm pondering right now. What I have in galleys, which I hope to have out in September, is a book called The Denver Civic Center, the heart of the Mile High City, focusing right on the Civic Center, City and County Building, Capitol, Golden Triangle, Convention Center District. And since after that, there's a lot that hasn't really been touched upon. There are a couple books out on Montclair proper, neither of which is really all that substantial. So, as I say, if you give me all sorts of good, juicy stories, they may just become part of another lecture of mine.
Do you have anything at all on the house on 14th and Quince on the south side of the street? It's a 2-story, maybe 3-story White House.
I know the building, and right off, I do not have any good
Anyway, it was supposed to be a farmhouse and it had acres and acres around it.
Yeah, because what happens is in the 1880s, as Denver is starting to boom, you get the Montclair subdivision and Richthofen's Montclair addition, sort of the area between Monaco and Quebec out of that. You then start getting other people staking the land off to the east of there with such subdivisions as Kensington. And actually, some of you probably live in the Kensington subdivision. In fact, what is Verbena Park these days, once upon a time was known as Kensington Park itself. But considering how Montclair is actually something of a flop, because you have something called the Panic of 1893 that just totally devastates economic values developments in town for about 10 years. The area off to the east of Quebec just starts becoming the farmhouse area, and every now and then you'd have somebody would buy 1 block, 4 blocks, 16 blocks, whatever, and he'd build sort of his mini estate there, with mostly farming land being around here. And it's really not until after World War II that you start getting the bulk of the houses about here going on. But even though an interesting thing is you go off to the east of Quebec Street, nearly up to Yosemite, every now and then, here and there, you have this vintage Victorian house still in place from earlier efforts to make this a country estate.
When I moved into my house in 1959, the lady to my north, her house was exactly like mine.
Yeah.
And she said she was in there in 1925.
Yeah.
She watched my house being built, and she said that there was not another house between her and Lowry. Not another house.
And,
1925.
And the 37 subdivisions within the statistical neighborhood of East Colfax, what now is sometimes called East Montclair, the earliest subdivision is 1887, and it's exactly that area around 14th and Quaince, all the way to where Lowry would be, where the Jarvis Military School was as well. The best subdivision name we've got though, Phil, in our neighborhood, Colfax Electric. Colfax Electric, best subdivision name we've got.
Okay, because actually that was interesting. In the course of the 1880s, electricity is this marvelous new device out of it. There was a subdivision out in South Denver called Electric Heights that had street names like Edison, Westinghouse, Joel, whatever, out of the various pioneers of electricity out of that. And see, again, that's actually another interesting thing, because you did have the streetcar coming and serving the area out here. Other than that, itself, originally the streetcar went all the way out to Aurora, and it ends up being discontinued only to about Poplar Street, with an extension to Lowry out of that. In fact, today there's an Ethiopian restaurant off near the southeast corner of about Colfax and Pontiac, and where that is, and there's a big parking lot in front of the place. That was the turnaround section for the termination of the streetcar until 1950, when they got rid of it. Meanwhile, that's as far as you can go, unless you want to transfer and wait for the bus and whatever. Go ahead.
I'm glad you didn't mention the Zanzibar.
Oh!
I recorded into there the night before I recorded into Lowry.
That was out of that Havana and Colfax itself out of that there. That's a whole different story. It's Aurora on the other side of Yosemite. So other comments? Yes.
Kind of a less specific question, but some of you may have a contribution to this too. I mean, somewhat so obviously attuned to change. You've seen Denver go through boom and bust cycles, and I think it's fair to say that Denver's in the middle of a boom cycle now. What do you think is different about what's happening in Denver today versus what happened, say, in the 80s?
Okay, back in the 1980s, there were voices of opposition. Federico Pena is elected mayor in 1983, supposedly as a fresh air versus the old establishment.
Yes.
He is extremely challenged in 1987 when there was a strong Republican anti-Pena movement. Wellington Webb projects himself as a voice of change in 1991, and by the time Webb is seeking his third term in 1999, opposition just completely collapses in town. Denver once had a daily newspaper. In fact, it used to have 2 daily newspapers. It does not have a daily newspaper newspaper today where the source of information that is readily available out there doesn't exist anymore. And meanwhile, you have the Denver Post, which is basically a publicity machine primarily for John Hickenlooper, and to a lesser degree for Hancock out of that. So that's one of the things that's changed. Another thing that has drastically changed at Denver is you used to know who was calling the shots of so-called 17th Street. The big banks were the head of First National Bank, Colorado National Bank, United Bank are always in the news. The head of public service is a kingpin. The head of Mountain Bell, a kingpin. Out of where you could just go and focus on who were the big money people shaping the city. Since then, every Denver big bank has sold out. Public service is part of Excel. Mountain Telephone is part of CenturyLink itself on that, where it's really nebulous, other than for the real estate industry, of who is actually running the city. Actually, that's another of my books out. It's called Denver in Our Time, Big Money in the Big City, that ends up focusing on the community, basically since World War II till the early 21st century itself. And one of these days I may have to do volume 3 of the effort. Volume 2 was DIA and other scams. So other question, comment? Yeah, back there.
I was wondering what prompted the scheme with the streets where they're all off that, well, not technically.
Okay, that's actually that's a book that's out of print of mine right now. Denver Streets, Names, Numbers, Locations, Logic. Denver streets were once completely chaotic, where every subdivision had its own set of streets. By the 1890s, the police didn't know where to go when they heard a report because they didn't know their way around the city. Likewise, the fire department, the water department, whatever. And in the name of coordinating, rationalizing the city, led by a guy named Howard Maloney, in 1896 to 1908, a series of alphabets is placed around town. Especially off to the west of Broadway, you have Tacoma, Bannock, Cherokee, Delaware, supposedly named for Indians. Another alphabet, Alcott, Bryan, Clay, Delaware, named for great Americans, scholars, military figures. Meanwhile, the alphabet off to the east of Colorado Boulevard was designed as a double alphabet, where the first street in the alphabet is supposed to be a geographical or a personal name. Albion, Bel Air, Claremont, Dexter. The second street is a flower, a tree, a plant, ash, birch, cherry, dahlia, so forth. And again, there's all sorts of exceptions in terms of that, but it was basically in the name of trying to rationalize the city so at least the police, fire department, and so forth could find their way around town, was why they put in the street reform.
And before the street reform, this was Deep Avenue out here, East 14th. It was Deep, D-I-E-P-P-E. And Tamarack was actually Oxford Street.
Yeah, that's what's in my Denver Street book.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It's a book that won't tell you how to find your way around town, but once you're lost, it'll tell you why you're lost, how you came to be lost, the history of the street on which you're lost, and that street used to be named. Yes?
Hey Phil, when did Colfax Avenue actually have its name changed to Colfax, and what was really the motivation behind naming it after Schuyler?
Okay, what happens on this is in 1864, there is something called the Congressional Grant. The Congressional Grant defines the borders of initial Denver, of basically Colfax on the south, Broadway on the east, the equivalent of 26th Avenue on the north, and Zuni Street right at the Platte River as the western edge of this. But originally, since Denver was founded by a bunch of crooks, they had crooked streets originally on that. It is not until 1868 that Henry C. Brown, who is the guy that is responsible for Capitol Hill and the Capitol, lays out his subdivision on the ordinal points of the compass east of Broadway. About the same time, John Evans, an early Colorado governor, stakes the land off to the south of Colfax, west of Broadway, on the east-west, north-south grid out of this. And one guy with whom he collaborates on laying out that land west of Broadway, south of Colfax, was Daniel Winter. Daniel Winter had married Clara Colfax. Clara Colfax's brother was Schuyler Colfax, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives from 1863 until 1869. After Schuyler Colfax is nominated for vice president in 1868, before starting the campaign, he comes out to Denver to visit his sister and brother-in-law. At this time, people like Witter and Evans are courting a guy known as Smiling Schuyler, because that's who Colfax was, Smiling Schuyler, this back-patting, smiling villain politician who's always glad to do favors for you, but if he does a favor for you, you better do a favor for him. Out of that there, and he is pushing for Colorado statehood if Denver will name something for him. So they have just put out this new road separating the diagonal grid of the congressional grant with the new development to the south of what is Colfax Avenue, and that's why they named the street Colfax Avenue.
And what year did they make that change?
1868.
68, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, other questions, or is it time to go and get the hot dogs and the bags?
Yeah, the hot dogs. Well, if there are no other burning questions, it might be a good time to take a little break.
Yeah, come up and buy books and other such things.
Let's take like a 10-minute break, and then we'll hopefully it'll get a little darker, and we'll watch Corky's films after that. Okay? Thank you, Phil.